Hi, I'm Gary Wockner, host of Overcoming Overshoot here on EarthX TV. Welcome to another episode of our show. Today, we are going to get an education about a new word and a new legal concept, ecocide. The title of our show today is Ecocide. Harming nature should have the same moral equivalence as harming human beings. Although not a completely new concept, ecocide is now being moved forward in Europe and in other parts of the world as a new criminal law. For example, if a corporation harms the environment, it could be held criminally liable. With me today are two of the world's leading experts on the concept of ecocide. Jojo Mehta is a graduate of Oxford and London universities and has a background in communications, entrepreneurship, and on-the-ground environmental campaigning. Jojo is the co-founder of Stop Ecocide and the chair of the Stop Ecocide Foundation. Welcome to the show, Jojo.
Thank you so much.
And also with me is Nemo Bassi. Nemo is a celebrated Nigerian environmental activist, author, and scholar. Nemo has held many posts and board positions in the international environmental community, including chair of Friends of the Earth, chair of Global Green Grants Fund, as well as being on the advisory board of Stop Ecocide. In 2010, Nemo was given the Right Livelihood Award, which is often called the Alternative Nobel for the Environment. Nemo, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
And Nemo is in Nigeria today, and Jojo is in England. So this is a truly international experience. So before we kind of get into ecocide, I'm wondering if, each or either of you have what I would call kind of the aha experience. Something happened in your life, perhaps when you were young, when you decided to dedicate your life to protecting the environment. Jojo, do you have any such story?
I absolutely do. And it actually happened not as long ago as my childhood, although my childhood was filled with a lot of walks in nature. And my mother was always, a strong naturalist and sort of instilled in us a love of nature. But the real kind of get up out of the armchair moment for me was not so many years ago, in about 2013, when I found out about fracking. And I was, I'd been a kind of armchair activist, if you like, for a while, signing petitions and writing letters to my elected representatives, that kind of thing. But in this instance, when I started researching about fracking or hydraulic fracturing and this unconventional mode of extracting oil and gas, and looking at the toxicity of that and the way that it was being rolled out and the effects that it was having on communities and on the environment, I was really shocked. And I was talking about it with my family and friends, and my little daughter, who was 5 years old at the time, suddenly burst into tears. And she said, "Mummy, I don't understand. If they're poisoning the ground, surely they understand that they're poisoning themselves too. You must call them and tell them to stop." And of course, I said, well, I'm not sure how much of a difference it will make if I just pick up the phone to these companies. And she said, "But Mummy, you have to do something. What are you going to do? Who can you talk to?" And we had recently been to the local elections, interestingly. I'd taken her with me to the ballot box. So she said, "Mummy, can't you talk to the voting man?" And so I went to our local representative to talk to him about fracking, with my daughter at my elbow saying, "You've got to talk to him." And I found that our local politician at the time did a fantastic job of that kind of classic political thing of slipping out of every question I asked and kind of avoiding all the things I was trying to bring into the conversation. I remember coming out of there and thinking, that is the last time that happens. That is never happening again. I'm going to inform myself. I'm going to make something happen around this. I'm going to really do something about it. And that's when I really got engaged with the whole environmental question.
Okay, Nemo, your turn. Of course, you've had a long career as an environmental activist. But was there any moment when you were young, or at any point, where you just decided, this is it, this is what I'm going to do?
I think I've been driven by circumstances in many things I've done in life. I grew up as a young adult in a situation where some countries in Africa were fighting for liberation. You had the liberation movements and a lot of literature that was circulating free of charge. You didn't need to buy the books. They were just being sent around the continent, stating the reason why colonialism had to end and why they had to be self-determination. So I grew up on that. And then in the late 1980s, I was a part of the human rights movement in my country. And then we're fighting for better prison conditions, better relationship with the military and all that. But soon I found out that this was not quite enough. Because in 1990, specifically, a particular community in the Niger Delta demanded for a discussion with an oil company, a transnational oil company that had polluted and contaminated their entire environment. And rather than go to discuss with the community and find a way to solve the problem, the oil corporation called in the security forces, the national security forces, and they just went in the night. 80 people were killed, about 500 houses were burned down. And that really was the turning point for me, that environmental justice was extremely cardinal. That we don't have a safe environment, we don't have a right to life. We can't live in a dead environment. And, so more and more, we see more and more this issue getting more complicated, oil companies getting more intransigent, and governments totally working hand in hand with this corporation. So this raised the urgency of the challenge, and that's been my life calling, more or less.
Yeah, thank you both for those stories. So I'm going to introduce the concept of ecocide. The first time I heard the word, I was at a board meeting of Global Green Grants Fund in Boulder, Colorado, and Nima was there, and we were standing at a bar, and we were both drinking wine, as I recall, and I was trying to describe to Nemo the environmental apocalypse I saw around the world, and he stopped. He said, "Ecocide." And since he said that, the word it's been burnished in my brain here, and I think about ecocide all the time. And so, Jojo, I wonder, again, our audience is probably relatively new to the concept. Tell us, like, what is ecocide?
So ecocide is a relatively new word. It was actually coined in 1970, and it was originally coined to describe the horrific environmental damage caused by Agent Orange in Vietnam. And there was discussion around the term in the early 70s, and there was a big environmental conference in Stockholm, where the leader of Sweden at the time, Olof Palme, talked about ecocide and about how this was something that the international community needed to pay attention to, this serious destruction of the environment. And so the word is relatively new, but it hasn't been discussed in the public arena a lot since then. Behind the scenes, there was some development, but recently, what we're seeing is an understanding of this word as a way of bringing together people's understanding. In fact, it's funny, what you just described is a very good example of why the word ecocide is so powerful. People can see environmental destruction happening around the world, but they don't have a term that brings all of that together, that brings it all together as a way to describe serious damage. And it literally means ecocide. Eco is from home and side is from to kill. It's like to kill one's home. And of course, the planetary ecosystem is our home. And so that's the sort of etymology of it. But the power of it, I think, is very much in what you just described. It's in people's understanding that there is a concept that can bring together all of this environmental destruction. And the interesting thing about it as well is when people kind of get it, and it's like kind of homicide is killing a person. Oh yeah, ecocide is destroying an ecosystem. And of course, once people understand that, they also at the same time tend to understand that it's wrong and that we need to stop it. So it's very powerful in that way.
And on your website where you describe ecocide, you have a long list of calamities, you might call them. And if you could just kind of like go through what some of those are in terms of, what are examples of ecocide?
So we use, as a kind of working definition, we say that it's mass damage and destruction of ecosystems. So we're looking at things like big oil spills, serious deforestation, overfishing of the kind that dredges up and destroys the whole seabed, excessive use of pesticides to the extent that, entire insect populations are being wiped out, and we're looking at the depletion of soils at an astronomical rate. We're looking basically at big scale, so widespread, severe, systematic, and I think importantly as well, committed with knowledge of the risks, because at this moment in time, those companies who are engaging in activities of this kind, they're no longer in a position, if they ever were, to say we didn't understand what the consequences would be of what we're doing. That information is now very clear and abundant. And so, there is this sense that Ecocide as a criminal act is committed with knowledge of the results of the acts that are being committed.
And Nimo, in your introduction, you described the situation with the oil spill there in Nigeria. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? In terms of how does something get to the scale of being, ecocide, as opposed to just, the constant environmental damage we see around, and what's going on in Africa, in specifically, and in Nigeria?
We're talking about massive scale of environmental degradation. I've seen environment that I would say is dead. You just see an environment, say this place is simply dead. It's being killed by human activity. But you see, nature is actually very resilient. And that's why I personally don't use the term fragile ecosystem. Every ecosystem is very resilient, but we don't have to pump on it and hit on it and just destroy it because it's strong. But nature has a way of getting itself back into shape, but not when human action knowingly poisons everything in the ecosystem. So I've seen many examples in Latin America, in Africa. Actually, you can find examples everywhere in the world because human activity, especially transnational cooperation activities and political activities, are deliberately toxic because they're just fighting for profit and don't care anything about the environment or the people who depend on the environment. I've had the misfortune of carrying out pollution tour of many countries, and instead of going to see nice things, I just get to see things that make me more angry. I've been to the biggest underground gold mine in Ghana. I mean, for a long time, gold was a major income earner for Ghana, and I find that the communities around the town where gold was mined has been so poisoned that people, even up to now, people are still being displaced from communities because of poison, because their water bodies are poisoned with cyanide, with tailings, and people keep on being pushed away because the environment is just damaged beyond measure. I've been to a place in South Africa called Witbank, where coal mines, not gold this time around, coal mines have been on fire. Underground coal mines on fire for over 50 years. Abandoned coal mines just burning, blazing. So when you look above the ground, you can feel the heat rising from above the ground. And you just wonder what's going on. And community people tell you, well, you can't really walk over that territory because you don't know where a sinkhole may appear under your feet, where you may just be dragged into the flames under the ground. That to me is clearly ecocide. Then if you come home to the Niger Delta, regularly I go to some communities just to sit down and get myself pumped up again so I don't think anything has been solved. I get myself angry enough to keep on pushing on. You find places like Inogoni, where oil spills cover an entire creek, an entire river just covered by oil spill. And then the air itself, when you get to the community, you're smelling hydrocarbons. You have a headache within 5 minutes of arriving in that community, but people are living right there. So you have a situation of ecocide going on continuously and people being poisoned, and very comprehensively poisoned. You find big gas furnaces burning 24 hours every day for decades in oil fields. This is totally incredible. And then one thing I found recently, the United Nations Environment Program carried out a research assessment of the Ogoni environment. And by 2011, they published a report that showed that in some places, hydrocarbons had penetrated the soil to a depth of 5 meters. This was in 2011. This year, when I visited some of those locations, they were being remediated. The pollution had gone down to 10 meters. This is simply incredible that your soil is poisoned, your water is poisoned, your air is poisoned, and then corporations still published sustainability reports saying they're doing very well. I mean, these corporations and the governments that work with them ought to be in the dock, and that's what Ecocide is all about, to bring them to justice and to make them accountable for the damage that is being inflicted, not once in a while, but continuously, routinely, knowingly, and this cannot be accepted.
And that's kind of a nice transition, Jodo, to the concept of turning ecocide into criminal law. And so I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that sort of process. Like how could ecocide become an international crime? Like what is the sort of governing body you're trying to work with to get that done, and sort of how the process might work?
Yeah, so we aim specifically to have ecocide criminalized at the International Criminal Court, which is based in The Hague and which has 123 member states. So, you know, nearly 2/3 of the world has signed up to the International Criminal Court. Now, so no, not every country has signed up, but I'll come on to why that may not matter as much as you think in the context. So, with the ICC, it's the only global mechanism that directly accesses the criminal justice systems of its members. So if you make something a crime at the International Criminal Court, at the ICC, then any country ratifying that crime must incorporate it in its own domestic legislation within a year. So if you want to create a new rule, a new law that will go across boundaries and have coherence internationally, then the ICC is the logical route to take. And so that's why we aim to move it forward there. And the way that that has to happen is that it needs to be proposed by a member state or a group of member states. And there are a certain number of stages. It's a 4-stage process, but it's not a particularly complex process. It just takes a bit of time. So a state has to propose it. Then the annual assembly has to approve it, if you like, with a simple majority in terms of putting it on the table for discussion. And then you move on to the adoption stage, which could take some time as states discuss the exact text, if you like. And then once it's adopted, the states can then ratify. But the power of doing this in this particular way is that because ecocide is mostly a corporate crime, it means that it could be prosecuted in any of the jurisdictions that ratify it. So it's a bit different to say war crimes, where a war criminal is probably unlikely to be prosecuted by their own state. And so their case will end up at the International Criminal Court, which is a court of last resort. Whereas with ecocide, you know, a CEO could be prosecuted in any country that ratifies. And that's where the power of it comes in with regard to countries that may not be signed up as members, because effectively, I mean, I'll give you a hypothetical example. Let's say a CEO from the US signs off on an ecocidal project in, I don't know, Venezuela, for example, but they have a corporate office in Belgium, then the crime could be prosecuted in Belgium. So effectively, I mean, a real life example, if you like, of this is the case of General Pinochet at the end of the 90s, who was arrested in the UK for effectively crimes against humanity. And he basically said, well, Chile is not signed up to this, so you can't touch me. And actually the UK Supreme Court said, well, you've set foot on our territory, we prosecute this crime, and so we have jurisdiction. And it's a principle called universal jurisdiction that can be used in, you know, any country that decides the crime is serious enough and has ratified it itself.
Now, just as an example, would you, and when you say prosecute, is that like, would you sue them, or would it be like a trial in a court, or what does that mean exactly?
Okay, so there's a bit of a difference. This is where we see the difference between civil law and criminal law.
Okay.
because suing people is essentially what you do in civil law. You have a direct kind of confrontation, if you like, between the individual or potentially the community and a particular company. They kind of go head to head. And that's a very expensive thing to do because they each have to employ lawyers to do it. And it can be long and difficult. And of course, corporations will do their absolute utmost to make sure that you don't win. And even if you do, they'll then get in the way of having to actually, cough up anything that they've been asked to compensate and so on. So, I mean, suing or civil litigation is a little bit like, I mean, it's a bit of a brutal analogy, but for a corporation, it's a little bit like, let's say you're beating up a woman and you're told you have to pay her some pocket money because you've made some bruises. And so you might do that, but then you can just carry on beating her up. That is effectively the situation with civil litigation. And that's not to say that it's not important to do it. It is important to do it. It creates an evidence base, it shames people, all of those things. But when you've got a criminal law, that's not about suing, that's about prosecution. That means that the state will prosecute. And effectively it's individual criminal responsibility. So you can't hide behind the corporation and you can't just make up for it by accounting for some extra legal costs. So it's a very different sort of ballpark. And a very simple example to explain this is, I mean, if you're walking down the street and somebody, beats you up, you don't sue them, you go to the police and the state prosecutes. And that is the situation that we want to see with this level of environmental destruction.
So Nimo, with the example that you brought up about the oil spill in Nigeria, first, is Nigeria part of the International Criminal Court? And if it would have been back when that spill happened and it's still ongoing, could you have tried to hold the corporation and the CEO accountable with this law?
Absolutely. Nigeria is part of the International Criminal Court, and as we speak, young people are threatening to drag the government before that court because of brutal responses to peaceful protests that has been going on. And so clearly the transnational oil corporations who have damaged our environment so thoroughly are very good candidates. As soon as this law is enacted, I believe they will be one among the first to be dragged there, because what they've done is totally unconscionable. So far, they've been getting away by hiding behind corporate shields. And whenever communities or individuals take them to court, they just try to settle the matter out of court. I don't see anybody settling Ecocide out of court. We cannot do that. And then leaders of corporations just have to be also held personally liable for directing the criminal activities going on in our environment. Otherwise, they just do whatever they do, knowing that it's a corporation that would answer for it. So we need a law that holds the corporation and those behind the corporations accountable. And then shareholders be careful where they put their money, because right now a lot of shareholders just kind of wait for the value of their shares and not really what goes on in the background to bring that kind of value that is not really valuable.
So Joe, go ahead. Yeah.
And I was just going to say this is one of the key points here, is that finance is kind of like water. I mean, funds will flow where they're allowed to flow. So, effectively putting this law in place is a little bit like kind of plugging a hole in the boat in comparison to these companies are fully invested in. And because the funds are continue to be allowed to go that way, these things don't stop. So, effectively, once something's made a crime, it's actually illegal to finance it and illegal to give a permit for it. So you're actually plugging that gap in a way that's very important, creates a kind of a guardrail, for future practices, actually starts to steer corporate practice in a different direction.
I want to bring, use an example. In the United States, we have a law called the Clean Water Act, and it's often used by activists like myself. When a corporation or even a government agency pollutes the water, you can sue them and in court, and then if you win, you can collect damages. But the Ecocide law is actually, it's more than that, because it's the government itself that would be criminally prosecuting the polluter. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely how it would and should work. And of course, in Nemo's case, he's actually looking at taking government actors to court. So he might well be looking directly at the jurisdiction of the ICC itself, if the government's not obviously going to prosecute its own members, perhaps. Whereas with a the situation of a CEO, they could be prosecuted within a certain jurisdiction without necessarily having to go to the ICC. But of course, I mean, Nimo, correct me if I'm wrong, but I suspect that in Nigeria, there's quite a strong connection between those big corporations and the governmental actors, or there could well be, in which case, potentially, one would want to be prosecuting elsewhere, whether that was the ICC or in another ratifying state, because in Nigeria itself, it might be harder for that to proceed because of existing relationships. Is that the case?
You are right. We have a very unholy matrimony between the corporations and the government. The laws setting up the corporations in our countries they were supposed to be progressive, but they're very colonial, actually. And they're working hand in hand. And in fact, in terms of oil extraction, in each of the corporations operating, the government holds the highest shareholder in the operation, and it's also an operator. So whenever we sue the companies, we also sue the government. They go hand in hand. So that's a bit tricky, and we have to find a way around that. And actually, there's a move now for the separation, for a kind of divorce between the state and these corporate transnational corporations, because it makes it extremely difficult for government to supervise or regulate an operation that they are also players in. So the corporations find a leeway to commit all kinds of crimes and get away with it.
So I know, Nemo, you're also involved in the rights of nature movement. I think you're on a board of an organization or two. So how does rights of nature, which we're a little bit more familiar with here in the United States, how does that relate to ecocide law, or would they kind of work together too? So,
absolutely, the two work together, but there will be some fine differences. Now, the right of nature can already be tested in some countries like Ecuador, like Bolivia, where it's been integrated into our national constitutions. So that this can be prosecuted within those kind of jurisdictions. And in fact, some years back, when the Gulf of Mexico oil spill occurred, BP was sued in Ecuador, because if you commit a crime against Mother Earth, if you affect the rights of Mother Earth, you could be sued anywhere Mother Earth is, and that's all over the planet. More or less the same as in the concept of ecocide in terms of jurisdiction. But so yes, I think that kind of marks out the difference. There are many other subtle differences because the rights of nature is much more philosophical and broad, yeah, so they work together. The ecocide law gives us the space to hold corporations or individuals criminally liable. And then, of course, the rights of nature gives us a broader picture, a much wider picture over many things. And then we have, with the rights of nature, a river has a right to exist as an individual, a mountain has a right spiritually and otherwise, and citizens also. We recognize other beings, living and non-living, as fellow citizens or children of Mother Earth.
Yeah, I would say there's an interesting kind of complementarity there, because it's almost like they're two sides of the same coin. It's like the rights on the one hand and the responsibilities on the other hand, which is where the criminal law comes in. So, I mean, one parallel might be to say that, we all have a right to life, but our right to life is protected because killing people is a crime. So murder is a crime, and that protects your right to life. In the same way, ecocide as a criminal law would protect the rights of nature.
And so I think it's also good to point out, because rights of nature, we hear about it in some places, and I've actually visited a few places, including the Wanganui River now in New Zealand, which had the first river which was given personhood status. Went on a wonderful canoe trip down there with some Maori tribes people. But it is sort of philosophical, and there's a lot of questions about if and how you can actually, sue someone because of rights of nature. But on the Ecocide law, you guys are actually making progress. I mean, you have some countries that have agreed to it and are literally trying to move this through the international court system. So, Jojo, I wonder if you can tell me, I mean, this is like becoming real. And so, give us a little bit of example of how, or what are the countries that are involved, and what are they doing, and is this a possibility to actually happen?
We very much believe so, yes. So the whole movement towards criminalizing ecocide has accelerated considerably in the last year or so. And I mean, there are a number of reasons for that, but I mean, one key one that I think it's worth mentioning here, particularly, Gary, as you mentioned that you have this activist background yourself, is that the civil mobilization that we've seen around the world, so the Sunrise Movement, Greta Thunberg's school strikes, the Extinction Rebellion, and so on, have made a huge difference to how much we're being heard in terms of talking about ecocide, because it's kind of widened the scope of the conversation in terms of the media and what they're prepared to talk about, and what politicians are effectively being pressured to now address. So that's one aspect. But on the sort of on the ground level of state support, last year in November, we had our first really major endorsement from a head of state, and that head of state was the Pope. Was Pope Francis, who obviously is head of the Vatican State, and in front of the International Association of Penal Law, he quite explicitly asked for ecocide to become a fifth crime at the ICC, and said that this was something that needed to happen in order to protect the planet. And shortly afterwards, in December, at the ICC's annual assembly, two small island countries, Vanuatu and the Maldives, spoke out in their official statements and asked the member states to seriously consider amending the Rome Statute, which is the governing document for the court, amending it to add ecocide. So that was a huge step. And actually, you remember earlier I was mentioning it was first brought up in an international forum in 1972, and actually never again until last year at that level, at that kind of UN ICC level. And so that was a really major step, and it brought the conversation back onto the level of international government, and that conversation. And then this year we've had key developments in France and in Belgium. So we've now had 4 states actually specifically vocally supporting, and we have parliamentarians from a number of other different countries also interested in discussing this. And that's a very exciting position to be in, because I think things are really starting to move. And literally, as we are recording this, various events are going on in association with the annual assembly of the ICC, which is happening, at least quite a lot of it is happening online this year for reasons of the COVID restrictions and so on. But that conversation is being continually amplified now in that forum, which is where we need it to move forward. So yes, it's very exciting.
And Nemo, from your perspective in Africa, we hear a lot about these kind of movements, especially in the so-called Western world and the developing world. But are you also feeling some energy and, I guess, excitement about this from your African colleagues and environmental activists in Africa as well as Latin America? Because I know, especially being part of Global Green Grants Fund, and you have a lot of connections around the world in the so-called developing world, that are non-Western. Are you also hearing some excitement about that?
Oh, yes. Especially at grassroots level, this is part of the cosmology that nature has rights and that ecocide should be a law. In Nigeria, there's a case of a particular river that's been promoted to have rights. The Ethiop River in the Niger Delta is one of the few rivers that is not totally damaged as most others are. And in fact, I believe early next year, there's going to be an international conference promoting the rights of that particular river. And the concept of ecocide will be part of the discussion. But generally, there's going to be a lot of uncoupling of the colonial ecology on the continent, because even conservation has a bad name and a bad approach, where certain parts of creation, parts of some of our relatives are given more space than humans, and this has very big pressure on communities who are losing land because certain territories are earmarked for tourism, for ecotourism, for purpose of any foreign exchange by governments. And so having the kind of conservation protection that actually protects human communities as well as other citizens, and I'm looking for a term to call relatives, other beings who are sharing the planet with. Having a balance is something that needs to, we one level of fight that we have to confront, so that people don't hide behind any law or rights of Mother Earth to further disenfranchise people and further displace people from communities. We're having very serious cases in climate action. You're having carbon slavery, where communities are forced to take care of trees just because of the carbon in the trees, rather than seeing trees as part of a living ecosystem. And so there are different levels of struggle, but all these are going hand in hand. Then it's going to be ecocide, rise of Mother Earth, will eventually lead to total liberation and total allowance of people to live in harmony with nature, which is the way forward, actually. So ecocide law is actually a big impetus for us to live within planetary limits, to respect the places we live in, because everybody knows, I mean, most people know, even though some would not admit it, that our continuous transformation of everything, colonization of the land, the sea, the sky, would not solve the problems confronting humans at this time.
And you brought up an issue I want to kind of ask if you can develop a little bit more, because, you know, here in the United States, in the environmental movement, we're hearing more about indigenous rights. And I think the kind of philosophy that you just described, you know, even though this word ecocide is relatively new, it is not a new concept, of course. It might be new to Westerners and people in the United States, but it's not a new concept that we have a right to, or we have a responsibility to the non-human world around us, because it is from that which we sustain our own existence. And so, you know, can you tell us a little bit more, Nimmo, just about the connection of like sort of ecocide law and its sort of the roots in sort of indigenous lifestyles and you know, values and those kinds of things?
Indeed. In most of our societies, we have very deep connections between individuals and the community. And when you talk about the community, it's not just a collection of people, it's a collection of it's the totality of the community. It's about the environment, it's about the people, it's about everything. It's about the culture, the spirituality, the economy. It's not about operation, it's not about exploitation, it's not about accumulation of personal goods or resources. It's about sharing. This is where we have the concept of Ubuntu, for example, which is widely known, that each person's humanity is tied to the humanity of the next person. You can expand that to be that our humanity is tied to the safety and security of the environment around us, because we don't live in space, we don't live in Mars, we live right here. In my local language, we call this etuwem, which means a good life, living the good life. You cannot say that you lived a good life because you have 10 billion US dollars in the bank account. That doesn't count at all. Yeah, the good life is a life that's lived in harmony with others, your neighbors, others around you, others in the community, as well as taking care of the environment. When you pass somebody's home, someone who has a garden around his home, who takes care of the environment in the community, you just, you send good energy, good thoughts to the owner of that, to the person who occupies that particular space. But when you see somebody else who damages everything, it's a very bad energy flows from that space and also from you, which is not very healthy for you, but you can't really help it all the time. And so there's this balance always of being very conscious of what people do with other beings and the environment around us. And we believe also that the things we call non-living and that we can exploit without even thinking is just because of our limited understanding. We think they are not living. We don't know what is living and what is not living. When I was growing up, my father, I learned from my father that whenever I eat, I should give a bit of it to Mother Earth, because the earth is our mother. And so up till now, if I take a glass of water, I don't finish it. I got to leave a little bit at the bottom of the glass. But you could interpret this in different ways, but it's part of being conscious of how we relate to where we live and not to damage it, and not to think that because we have the opportunity to destroy, to transform, to appropriate, that we should do that. There must be restriction. And this law brings about that impetus, that opportunity for people to learn to stop misbehavior.
I would totally agree with that. I think what's wonderful about what Nimo just elaborated is that there's something about the law of ecocide that reflects this sense of reciprocity that Nimo is just describing, that we have to be thankful and have this connection with the earth. And there's it's actually deeply understood by the world's indigenous cultures that if you damage Mother Earth, there are consequences. That's a fact. That's not a rule that you decide in your head. That's actually a fact that's out there, and it's one that's becoming ever more increasingly obvious to all of us, that when we destroy nature, there are consequences, and those consequences are becoming increasingly apocalyptic. So reflecting this sort of reciprocity, if you like, in the form of this law is actually, it's kind of I feel quite intimately related with that understanding. And I think it starts to kind of bring us back towards the awareness that we are, of course, as Nimo just described, completely interconnected with the ecosystems around us. And I think in the West, we've had a bit of a disastrous background in terms of this, because we have this very separate mindset. So, you can go back, it goes back as far as Plato. You've got the split between the ideal and the real. You've got in the Catholic Church, you've got the split between the spiritual and the physical. And then you keep going into the Enlightenment thinking, and then you've got the split between the rational and the emotional, or the nature and the masculine and feminine. All of this kind of dualism runs right through Western history. And it's almost unsurprising that we've ended up with this incredibly skewed idea that somehow we get to dominate nature. Ultimately, that's, it's like, believing that we can continue to extract resources on a finite planet is a bit like believing the earth is flat. I mean, if you keep walking west far enough, you're going to realize you're wrong. We just really have to, change the laws that can protect us, so that we don't end up in a situation where we have to actually prove by doing it that you can't extract any more from the planet.
Kind of connected to what you just said. Are you having much success getting sort of mainstream environmental organizations kind of on board with this idea? And I'll just make a little bit of a subjective statement. Here in the United States, a lot of the big groups, they tend to be kind of corporate and moderate and sort of boring, in my opinion, and they kind of stand in the way of progress rather than actually helping it move forward. And I know a few of the international groups are more involved in this, but how is the concept moving forward just in the broader environmental movement? Are you having success at getting any groups to kind of adopt it?
It's a really good question, and it is taking time, because interestingly, I think the concept of ecocide, becoming a crime has been always felt to be a bit extreme, maybe even a bit kind of pie in the sky. That'll never happen. Lovely idea, but it'll never really happen. And I think at this point, I would just love to bring in the figure of Polly Higgins, because I worked with her for many years. We were very, very close colleagues and friends, and I worked with her very closely until she died. And she's probably the name that's most strongly associated with this concept of ecocide. And, she would get this kind of response all the time, yes, lovely idea, it's never going to happen. And often that would come from environmental organizations, particularly perhaps the more established ones. But she was absolutely single-minded about this particular concept and this particular route to following it. And she kind of kept that flame alive, if you like, for all of that time. And just really, I mean, in the last week of her life was when the Extinction Rebellion in the UK was happening in London. So there was a big rebellion in April last year around Easter, and Polly died on Easter Day. But that was the first time that she saw that word ecocide and that, you know, stop ecocide actually taken to the streets. And I would say, and I think I'm not sure what Nimo feels about this, but I would say that the grassroots pressure of, you know, public activism has actually been probably more instrumental in moving this forward than established environmental NGOs. And that's not to say that they're against it or that they're not coming on board, because I think slowly that is starting to happen. But I think it's very interesting that the real push here, you know, came from the grassroots and the pressure of civil mobilization. And I think it's one of those things where if you ask the people, you know, if you go to the people and you explain what ecocide means, I mean, I've yet to meet someone that says it's a bad idea. I mean, you know, it's one of those kind of light bulb sort of moments for people often, and that's quite inspiring for us. You know, when we're talking about it, we literally see the light come on in people's eyes, you know, and they go, oh my god, yes, imagine if we could criminalize that. That just makes total sense. It's a no-brainer. Why hasn't it already happened? You know, so I think, yeah, I mean, I would really credit the grassroots decisions. And I think when you look at what's happened in France, you can really see that it's almost like a pilot scheme for how this could go, in the sense that, you know, Macron started talking about ecocide last year. He referred to the deforestation in the Amazon as ecocide, but twice the government refused to talk about it at the governmental level. However, when they brought together a citizens' climate assembly, which they did in response to the whole situation with the Gilets jaunes, where the French government had introduced a tax on fuel, and it was very, very unpopular. There were lots of protests, and it was intended to be a climate measure. And so the government said, well, okay, you don't like our climate measures. What would you put in place as a policy? And the top policy they came back with was criminalize ecocide. So I think, you know, it's like, I find it very encouraging and heartening, actually, that at the level of ordinary people, you know, just having this conversation and expanding this conversation is actually quite obviously making the difference at the political pressure level.
Nemo, from your perspective, go ahead. Yeah,
just to add on to that, the issue of the established non-governmental organizations. I think many of such organizations, there are such organizations that behave just like transnational corporations, that are totally disconnected from grassroots, from reality on the ground, and they're working for corporate interests, unfortunately. And they are thoroughly kind of creating harm for communities and for environments in the name of protecting and conserving the environment. And many of the laws, many of the policies that have been made in nations and in multilateral spaces are also greenwashed by this kind of organizations. So we really, I mean, the challenge that some, not all, some that are good, of course, the established grassroots-based organizations, big ones in the world, that are doing quite good, very good job. But there are others who are really on the other side and creating more problems in the name of environmentalism.
Jojo, I wonder if you could just finish up pointing us to your website. And I think there's also a way that individuals can sign up. And I actually went on the website yesterday and stuck my name in there. So tell us what people can do to learn more. Where can they go to learn more, and how can they stick their name in and get on the email list? And I got on the email list, and I've already gotten emails, which is pretty cool.
Fantastic. I'm delighted to hear it. So our website is stopecocide.earth. And we have, I mean, there's a lot of information on that site, but there's a whole list of actions that you can take quite quickly or immediately, even when it comes to just signing up. We have an international petition, which is a kind of ongoing petition in the sense that we want to show the accumulating support for this. And then if you go a step further, you can actually become a kind of subscribed member, if you like, to our organization, and we call our paid up members Earth Protectors. So you can become an Earth Protector by gifting into the fund, and the funds that we get through those signups, they go directly towards the strategic work, legally and diplomatically, taking this forward at the international level. So there's some very obvious ways of joining in. and finding more information. But I would also say that whatever arena you work in and whatever your network is, it's very important to have the conversation. Talk about it. Use the word ecocide because it's very, very powerful. And the more different arenas and the more different NGOs and the more different networks, are using this word and communicating about it, the more that word is becoming a mosquito in the ears of the politicians. And that is really important.
Thank you very much. I could sit here and talk to you both all day long. This has been just music to my ears. And as I mentioned this story at the beginning, when Nemo said ecocide, it got burnished in my brain. And I think anybody who's watching this will probably also feel, I think it's bigger than a mosquito. I think it kind of gets stuck up here, and that's probably a good thing. So thank you both for being on the show today.
Thank you so much.
And again, I'm Gary Wockner. You're watching Overcoming Overshoot here on EarthX TV.